Before we start the show, let me thank you for clicking onto this video. If you'd like to see more videos like these, why not subscribe and hit the bell button so you'll never miss an episode. Now, on with the show. Hi friends, I'm LJ Jarvis, and welcome back to another episode. I'll be frank with you, this was a video I didn't think I'll be doing. I believe you guys already knew my take on the whole subject of 40k being a satire or not, so I didn't see a point in making a video where I'll be sharing the same opinion from Twitter and the podcast. However, I also believe that this is a subject that I am passionate about and that it should be made into a video, where I can just get all out instead of doing a thread of tweets the length of a Bible page. To get straight to the point though, I don't believe Warhammer 40k is a satire. I'll even go so far as to say that it hasn't been a satire for decades. Despite what GW will claim, I don't think they believe in their own statement, all of which I'll explain during the video. But first things first, why do people say 40k is a satire? Where did this come from? Well, to go back in time, Warhammer 40k began as a mere rulebook called Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader. The book itself wasn't a proper addition to 40k as people might imagine it when compared to other editions. It was more of an expansion piece to Warhammer Fantasy, where you're able to take the fantasy game but put it into space, basically. Everything from lore, rules, model stats, DM rules, all of that was found within one tome. It was basically 40k's rough draft, fresh liquid concrete served straight from the mixer. But after the book, because it became so big and popular, this is where GW would make 40k into a game of its own right. Second edition will arrive shortly after, with a polished rulebook, smoothed out lore, and codices for armies made exclusively for the game. So it's appropriate to call second edition the proper first draft to 40k. It was something in which the game had an identity, had a story to tell, armies to present, a universe that felt much bigger than Rogue Trader. The concrete here has been set into the foundations of 40k. And finally, by third edition, this is where 40k had been fully polished. This is the edition where 40k found its look and presentation that still carries out to this day. It was the final draft where 40k became 40k. The grimdark setting that's like a vodka shot that stood out from the soft drink sci-fi settings like Star Wars or Star Trek, and other hobby games like D&D. Now, novel writers such as Dan Abnett would say that Rogue Trader started off as a satirical game centered around, end quote, Margaret Thatcher fascism. And from previous claims from word of mouth, statements such as this give, who I believe to be the politically obsessed, an argument that even modern-day 40k is political satire. And because they claim it's a satire, GW needs to make a 180 on the setting and go back to the days of Rogue Trader. Because, of course, everything must be political, everything must be about modern politics, there's no such thing as escapism, yeah? Despite these claims though, and despite Dan Abnett's point of view, brilliant writer though he is, I believe there's a misconception here. Let's tackle this sort of thinking about 40k piece by piece. First and foremost, what makes something a satire? Well, according to a quick Google search, satire is the use of humor, irony, exaggeration, or ridicule to expose and criticize people's stupidity or vices, particularly in the context of contemporary politics and other topical issues. Okay then, we have our definition of what makes something satire. What can we use as an example of this definition? To borrow from another franchise, The Boys is a satirical story about the concept of superheroes. I'm using a TV show instead of the comic books as the example here, as I think it has done a better job at the subject and it's the overall better product. The show amplifies the original concept of the comics by also using it as a spotlight on celebrity culture, influence of mega corporations, and modern-day superhero-obsessed culture, where superheroes are about a brand who care more for image and money over the roles they're supposed to play in society. And because of that, people get hurt and vengeful victims plot revenge. This is my example of a saying being a satire. Yeah, something to comment on, to exaggerate, and to ridicule over what seems to be a superhero-obsessed climate. And even though what it has to say can be as subtle as an F-150 missing its muffler, it at least has something to say. It has something to comment on and to poke fun of, but not to the point where it's basically just a superhero movie. Now, for 40k, people would make an example that a character such as Gazgul is a satirical parody of Margaret Thatcher. Therefore, 40k is political and satire. I already made a video about that subject, however, so I won't spend too much time on something I already made a video about. To be short though, there's nothing about Gazgul that indicates any sort of relationship with the former Prime Minister. And creators of 40k, such as Andy Chambers, would even say that, no, Gazgul is not Thatcher. If anything, if you wanted Gazgul to be a parody of Thatcher, GW could have given him her hairstyle, given him blue armor, be a female orc, be a leader of an orc clan called Tories, with 2 Zs instead of S's, or anything that would connect a fictional character with something he's supposed to make fun of. But no, there's nothing about Gazgul that makes you think of Thatcher. And even if you're able to pull something from the lore that has some sort of warped connection with the Prime Minister, I'm sorry, I don't think that's good enough. Going back to The Boys, you can obviously see Homelander as a parody of Superman. The design of his costume, his superpowers, how he leads a superhero team, his narrated backstory as an American man from a nuclear American family, the semblance is there at first glance. That's usually how a satirical or parody depiction of a character or figure is supposed to be. I personally believe that it needs to be something obvious. It's not the same thing for Gazgul though. But outside of Gazgul, a few will comment, well, the Imperium of Man is a satire of fascism, henceforth 40k is political satire. And while this topic can be an entire podcast for how meaty the subject is, that's something I won't focus too heavily on. I think people like Arch have already discussed this subject to the point where, if I were to do it, my take would just be a copy-paste of his own work. So instead of going through each single political motivation of Mussolini and or Hitler, and what connection they may or may not have with the Imperium of Man, let's go into the simpler things that a few people would make the connections. The obvious being that the Imperium of Man has an eagle, therefore it's fascist, a few would argue. Well, besides the obvious design differences and the number of heads, it's an obvious no-brainer that the sole argument that eagle equals fascist is not an argument. There are far too many countries throughout history that have used eagle iconography for their nation and or empire. And considering how Rogue Trader was made as an expansion piece to Warhammer Fantasy, there's more of a connection of the Imperium of Man being the 40k version of Fantasy's Empire of Man. Whilst the Empire of Man is obviously the Holy Roman Empire, I wouldn't be surprised if GW decided not to use a Reichsadler, as the connection to the real-world empire would be too obvious even for them. So instead, they use griffins, iron crosses, Totenkopf skulls, symbols that speak German for the Germanic-like empire. When creating 40k, I wouldn't be surprised if the creatives borrowed the original idea for using the HRE Reichsadler, but put on the Imperium of Man. So yes, the Imperium of Man has a sprinkle of German influence, but not the kind that others might think. Because when comparing the eagles and what went into the creation for the Imperium of Man during the days of Rogue Trader, it's obvious that the Imperium is a sibling to the Empire of Man, and the inspiration for the Empire got piggybacked by the Imperium. Not only that, but a double-headed eagle is a symbolic piece not just tied with the Holy Roman Empire. It's obviously not just tied to one nation. It's something many empires in history have used because of the symbolism of it. For the Byzantines, is a symbol of office over both secular and religious rule of the emperor, something the Imperium is obviously connected with. Rule over both politics and religious dogma that we see with the Imperium. Though of course, in 40k's lore, the eagle has his own history. Let's remember, the Imperium's original emblem was a single-headed eagle. Because, well, the eagle is a mighty animal that flies in the sky. Something no different from any kingdom using, say, a lion. It's a strong animal, and many empires and nations have used eagles in the past, from the Roman Empire to the modern-day United States. Yet, when the Emperor made his unification with Mars, the eagle gained an extra head to represent the relationship, the marriage between the Emperor's newly born empire with the Mechanicus. So with the creative origins of the Imperium's eagle and in-lore creation and meaning, no, it's not, quote, a Nazi symbol. People are smarter than that. And with GW themselves being history buffs when it comes to what inspired what within their settings, armies, characters, etc., you can't argue eagle equals Nazi. Besides that, a few people will go off to say that the Imperium is fascist satire because it's a brutal regime. Well, immediately I throw the fascist argument out the window because, well, no one knows what makes something fascist. It doesn't matter what book you may find, what a scholar would tell you, or what Google has to say. Fascism is not a clear political system that people can define. It was something that left as quickly as it arrived. And socially, it's an abused word that has no meaning anymore. And even writers who have centered their careers on the subject will even think so too.
The word fascism is almost entirely meaningless. In conversation, of course, it is used even more wildly than in print. I have heard it applied to farmers, shopkeepers, social credit, corporal punishment, fox hunting, bullfighting, the 1922 Committee, the 1941 Committee, Kipling, Gandhi, Chiang Kai-shek, homosexuality, Priestley's broadcasts, youth hostels, astrology, women, dogs, and I do not know what else. Almost any English person would accept bully as a synonym for fascist. That is about as near to a definition as this much abused word has come.
No one knows what makes something fascist, and I'm not going to pretend that I do. As for the argument that the Imperium is fascist because it's brutal and therefore satire, well, why is the Imperium the way it is? That's something I think politically motivated individuals tend to glance or purposefully ignore. Remember, after the Emperor's Great Crusade to unite mankind's lost colonies, the Space Marine legions broke out into a civil war in which the Imperium could never recover from. The Emperor would be placed on the Golden Throne, and the loyalist Primarchs would either be lost, slain, or put into stasis like their father. And with his military now fractured, which would become even more fractured after the Age of Apostasy, the Imperium, like its Emperor, is now a rotting carcass, a worn engine that can break at any minute. The Imperium is doing everything it can to hold itself together, whilst at the same time dealing with threats at all sides that they simply don't have the manpower to properly eliminate, which is why aliens such as the Tau Empire still exists. If this was a 30k Imperium, the Tau would be exterminated as soon as they show their faces to the galaxy. But because the Imperium must deal with threats across the galaxy, they simply don't have the option to deal with the Tau, especially when it's revealed that they're able to fight back and even do damage. If not most of the time, the Imperium can only react to the threat, but they don't deal with it permanently. Despite the power of the Inquisition and the military branches across the Imperium, there's barely enough to hold off the ever-present threat to humanity, a famous quote would read. Well, they're xenophobic, a few would argue. Well, of course it is. But that would imply that the Imperium has an irrational fear of Xenos, i.e. aliens. Orcs, Eldari, Drukhari, Necrons, Tyranids, Tau, these are aliens who either want to wipe out humanity, enslave it, or brainwash it. You can't reason with something like an Orc, a Necron, or a Tyranid. Not a Drukhari, that's for sure. You can talk with a Tau ambassador, but at the end, they want you to be part of their cult empire. In any Eldari story, such as Azurman the Darker Road, the space elves would talk down at humans for being inferior to them. They are contemptuous that humans exist and have influence over the galaxy, whilst they themselves have lost that said influence. Not because of what humanity did, but because of what they themselves did. Even after they gave birth to Slaanesh and doomed their own souls, they have too much hubris most of the time to accept their own failures. They'll still wave a finger at species they see as a lesser.
Rangers report that other creatures have occupied Hieronathela in our absence. Rude creatures with little culture or society. Slow and clumsy. Psychically dull. physically inept. Monkey.
So, let me ask you, is any of that an irrational phobic fear? And do we really have to go on about what role chaos plays within 40k? Something that corrupts humanity with exposure to what is basically hell, the gods that rule it, and the demons that occupy it. Is the fear and desire to destroy chaos just an irrational fear of alternate beliefs? Well, this alternate belief and idea for Imperial citizens, and what the rebels almost always turn towards, is not exactly any better. In fact, if you're not a super soldier ruined by warp corruption or an insane fanatic, chaos isn't too accessible. But the point is that all factions in this game contribute to the galaxy being such a worst case scenario, where there's only war because there is no other option besides death. Where it's not a question of, can there be another way, or can we all find a way to live amongst each other? This is not the saying where the option exists. It's only war, because in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And most importantly, this is not what the Emperor or his Primarch sons wish for humanity. The modern day Imperium of Man, if anything, instead of being a satire, and because of how it presents itself, it's more of an allegory for the worst fate that can fall upon humanity. Which is why many 40k players would tell newcomers that think of any regime in humanity's history, literally all the worst scenarios that have happened, but cranked up to 11. A Greek tragedy, in a way. And even one of the Emperor's own sons would say just how much humanity has failed his father's dream.
Why do I still live? What more do you want from me? I gave everything I had to you. To them. Look what they've made of our dream. This bloated, rotten carcass of an empire is driven not by reason and hope, but by fear, hate, and ignorance. Better that we had all burned in the fires of Horus's ambition than lived to see this.
People will then say, well, no, 40k is satire because it released a blog. Well, despite their claims that 40k is satire and how they define satire, 40k has not been presented as something of satire for some time. Presentation is key, and their presentation of 40k is something not of satire. It's not something that criticizes or parodies. It's not something where fans are distant from the setting and not wishing to be a part of. But by encouraging players to do things like create their own Space Marine chapters, their own Eldar craft worlds, their own Tau enclaves, their own Necron dynasties, etc., etc., and by marking 40k in its presentation through video games, toys, t-shirts, and where fans have made animations before GW ruined them, they've made 40k as something for players and fans to be part of, to interact with and find escapism, where you root for characters from Grimaldus to Fabius Bile, and that's okay. Like it or not, 40k is escapism for people. It's not a famous game and setting because of its supposed satire, but because of how big and epic the universe is. The only kind of people that would whine that GW shouldn't market 40k with stuff like Funko Pops or use words like heroes of the Imperium are those who have a war perspective on life. People can distinguish fiction from reality. The majority can, at least. The only reason why the article was made was because one guy was being a jackass at a convention, enough people vomited and ranted about it. GW made the article in less than a day and continued on with their business. Despite their claims that 40k is a satire, they've changed nothing in their business practice. They continued on as normal because they believed by telling the weirdos what they wanted to hear that it would all go away. But no, the politically motivated and spiteful reporters like Kotaku tried shaming them for not making 40k political enough, for having to remind fans that the Imperium is the bad guy, as if there are good guys in this sort of setting. Weirdos would go, oh, don't make t-shirts of fascists, don't lionize them in art, despite GW doing this for decades. And even if someone wears a Ultramarine shirt, so what? Imagine being a dork ranting to someone for wearing a t-shirt of the Galactic Empire from Star Wars. GW hasn't changed their presentation of 40k, and they won't because it makes them money. Despite their blog, they're still going to present Space Marine 2 as a video game epic. They're going to ignore the weirdos who would say, "But you said 40k has no heroes. Why present Captain Titus as a hero?" No one thinks this. And most importantly, they're not going to throw away the 40k they've built up and start over. 40k has never been good as supposed satire from Rogue Trader. If anything, because of how it presented the supposed satire at the time, it was a quarter-baked attempt of it. It didn't work, but they were interested in it saying so much that they continued building it up till it became something bigger than Warhammer Fantasy. GW knows, through years of building up 40k, that it's not a satirical work, or at least anymore, because their presentation of it does not give off such an impression. Above all else, it's a hobby game of plastic models and books. Don't raise it on that much of a pedestal, because it's weird that you think a game should have that much involvement with the political climate. This has happened before, and it was the fundamentalist Christian preachers who barked at D&D. And now, it's the social activists. So, at the end of it, weirdos want 40k to be about one-sided politics, because that is how people want fictional works about modern-day politics to be about. And people ranting about a dead politician have made it obvious. But GW won't, because they made 40k as something of escapism. Instead of satire, the themes of 40k are more of allegories for a saying in which what could go wrong goes wrong. Hence the famous tagline. GW wrote their article just to be in the clear, but it's not good enough for the politically motivated. And well, too bad, because a corporation likes money. However, that is my point of view. I would be interested though in hearing your take on this. What's your opinion on the discussion of 40k being a satire or not? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all again next time. Have a good one, guys.